there's a very funny anecdote about Putin. It has to do with the national anthem. So when there was these big debates about what they should do with the national anthem, and Putin set up an ostensible consultation process, but it really seemed like he had his mind made up anyway, like from the beginning. And what he basically did was they used the music of the Soviet era anthem, but they replaced like the lyrics with all these references to like sacred Russia and God. Here, the thing about Putin, consummate pragmatist, too pragmatic. We talk about him being crazy in the West. No, right? Lack of vision, that's his problem.
The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. All right, so Conrad Hamilton is a friend of the show, as they say. He is our resident contemporary Stalinist. He is an author of many articles and parts of books and books. He's got a book coming out from Historical Materialism called Marxism Contra Subjectivity, which we'll discuss. You'll explain it to me. Then also, and one of the chapters of in another book is called The Apostate Fascism of Aleksandr Dugin.
Yeah,
and we can discuss Dugin. But overall, it's been a while. Check in. What are you up to these days, Conrad? Do you want to talk about what you're doing?
There's a lot of things going on. I've been working on 4 books actually lately. Mm-hmm. By the way, I want to say before I continue, I love when you use this contemporary Stalinist label, because I never assented to this, but I'm a little bit like, Jordan Peterson when I think someone said to him, they said, people think you're like an incel god, how do you respond to this? And he's like, well, I don't reject it. I mean, someone has to represent them. And so this is like Trump, like Peterson, I do not disavow the term. If you're going to apply it, we'll just go with that. Okay. Somebody's got to represent them. Okay.
No, I didn't think you would disavow it. I mean, I know you operate in good faith. So,
great. So I'm working on 4 books right now. Mm-hmm. And we're not going to dwell on that too much because I want to launch into talking about the apostate fascism of Aleksandr Dugin and Russia and all of that, which is what we're here to talk about today.
Primarily to talk about, but I also want to hear about Marxism Contra Subjectivity as well overall, if you have things to say about that.
Yeah. Well, the 4 books, there's a book on video games that I've submitted to a publisher. It hasn't been accepted yet. It's called The Contagion of Reality. There's a book called Flowers for Marx that is sort of like Sublation Socialists, the book, the deviationist fan page that somehow was rendered an official part of Sublation Media. But you can check that out on Facebook, Sublation Socialists. But it's kind of like the book form of that. So we have a bunch of essays discussing Marx and particular attention being paid to the Althusserian humanism versus science debate. But in that, we have Matt McManus, myself, Ben Burgess, Marion Trejo, Ernesto Vargas, and Elliot Rosenstock. And also a foreword by this guy. I let him write the foreword. I'm not really sure if his credentials are really there. It's a little bit sloppy intellectually.
It's me, everyone.
It's Doug Lane. Doug Lane actually wrote the foreword. So you'll hear more about that in the future. And I'm also working on a collection of essays on real abstraction that'll be published by the Historical Materialism book series of Braille. And we have, people like Alberto Toscano and Jayla Mansour, Roberto Finelli, and so on, some great authors contributing to that. And that'll deal with also heavily with Son Rethel's work on real abstraction. And we have the thesis, which you mentioned, which Marxism Contra Subjectivity. It's my PhD thesis, revised and edited. Be coming out on the Historical Materialism book series of Brill. And how should I sum that up. In the book, I'm interested in the idea of real abstraction. So we could say the idea that, dualism, as we understand it, or even the Kantian categories of the pure understanding, arise from the structure of the value form. So that to give us a deeper sense of the history of Western philosophy and Western culture, we have to have an understanding of Marx's economic categories and how they operate at the level of form. And I essentially interrogate in the book a lot of the new developments in philosophy, things like speculative realism that have attempted to critique anthropocentrism or correlationism, the idea you can only understand the external world in relation to the observer, a little bit like Kant with his categories. And I kind of argue that, the difficulty of getting beyond these forms of dualism or these kinds of epistemological circumscription lie in the fact that these people don't take up these problems at the level of economy. So we have to understand the kind of sedimentary layers of economic practice that have formed our society, and only then can we sort of proceed to a critique of philosophy. So it's long. It's quite long. It's longer than the Phenomenology of Spirit, or 1,000 Plateaus. Yes, I did Google the word counts in order to be able to say that. And I think I'm.
How many pages are just you typing "all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy"? Tell me honestly.
Well, not literally that, but maybe I think the thing is that in the course of that many pages, there are going to be parts where you bullshit a little bit. But I would like to think that when people pick up a book that long, well, first of all, they probably won't read it. But I would like to think that they want to see an author kind of stretch out and experiment, right, like a jam session.
With my second novel, I also hoped that people wouldn't read it, so I understand. I really.
Well, I didn't say I hope that didn't read it. I said that I'm not getting my hopes up that they will actually read it. But it looks like it's a very sophisticated looking book. When it comes out, it's big. When you get it on your shelf, you're going to look real smart if you have it.
Yeah. All right. So let's talk about the apostate fascism of Aleksandr Dugin.
Okay.
And I know who Aleksandr Dugin is a bit. I've seen interviews with him. My understanding is that, some people say he is the state philosopher that informs Putin. Others say that his claims to power, or those who want to attribute a lot of power and influence to him, are overstating the case. But who is Aleksandr Dugin for people who don't know?
So Aleksandr Dugin, often he's characterized as a kind of Russian fascist or para-fascist philosopher. This idea that he has a really decisive influence on Putin's politics, I think it was first sort of advanced by Foreign Affairs magazine. They ran an article, I believe, called Putin's Brain Foreign Policy magazine, I think, Foreign Policy, FP. Mm-hmm. They ran an article called Putin's Brain in 2014, and that began this sort of kind of hermeneutically suspicious genre of reading, in which there became a strong tendency within the West to interpret Dugin as being this sort of wily, oracular figure who was whispering words into the ear of the master, Putin. But that's actually something I take up in my essay because I find it quite interesting. I mean, I don't think there's a lot of evidence that Dugin has a direct influence on Putin. There are other people he's influenced by, like Berbatov and Ilyin, and so on. It's difficult to say exactly. I mean, what is clear is that, he never met Putin. That's pretty well established. Putin's never shown a special interest in his work. And also, I believe that, I think it was 2014, during the Maidan crisis and the ensuing, events in Crimea, that Dugin was fired from Moscow State University, where he had a position there, because he was talking about Ukraine. He said something like, kill, kill, kill. So, people got mad. They said, because in Russia, they also have their own, parapolitical correctness, so they thought, well, this isn't appropriate. And he was fired. And, you also have to ask yourself the question, well, if he was so central to the government, would they have allowed him to have been terminated under those conditions, right?
Now, he was recently targeted by Ukrainian drones or U.S. drones. Is that and his daughter was killed?
I don't believe it wasn't drones, right? My understanding is that he went to again, I don't write about this in my essay, which is a 20,000 word essay. I don't write about it partly because and obviously it's very sensitive when he's issue with his daughter being killed. But I believe what happened was that he went to some kind of folk cultural festival in Russia, which is like a natural thing to do, of course, if you're sort of a far right philosopher. And I think that he was supposed to take a sort of chauffeured vehicle away from the festival. And he ended up taking another vehicle, but his daughter, I believe it's Darya Dugin, who's been a correspondent for Russian media, and I think something of a state ally. She got in it, and then I think there was a car bomb. Could be wrong. Okay. I think there was a car bomb.
Okay, car bomb.
Yeah.
So why?
By the way, I want to say before we continue, I want to say about this essay that we're going to know in a few days, but there's a very good chance that this will be published as a pamphlet with sublation. I'll confirm that in about 3 days. It looks probable. And also, I want to say before we get deeper, actually on November.
Is this with Everyday Analysis or with me? Because I know I was talking about it with you, but are you talking to Alfie as well? Because we have 2 lines of pamphlet series. But,
okay. I have to double check. I have to double check that. But one of them, Everyday Analysis or Sublation, will be publishing it.
Right. But you were telling me before that this essay was going to be a book chapter, and you needed it to be delayed until.
Well, there's some different things going on, but let me just we're going to know in a few days whether that's going to be a pamphlet that's coming out with Everyday Analysis or Sublation.
I want it for Sublation, but maybe I would want it. Let's keep talking about it.
Okay. Well, let me say something here though. I'm going to be going to London on the 8th. So I'll be presenting this essay at Historical Materialism on the Thursday there at 7:00 on November 9th at SOAS. So if you're at the conference there, it's the biggest Marxist academic conference in the world, Historical Materialism. You can catch me there. But also Alfie will be organizing an event on November 13th. That's Monday, a few days later, at the Stapleton Hall Tavern in Finsbury Park. So it's 7 p.m. along with Christopher Hogg. We'll be talking, I think, about his own personal relation to Michael Jackson. I'll be there talking about this essay. So if you're in London or you're around London and you want to come check out Historical Materialism, or see me talk about this essay and have a conversation at the Stapleton Hall Tavern on the 13th, you can do that as well.
So the question I was going to ask you, and then we can move on to describing Aleksandr Dugin's political vision and the ideas in your essay, is if he was not a key part of the Putin administration, if he was not an influential political figure on state policy, why was he targeted, do you think? And who targeted him?
Well, you mean about the I think that if you're talking about what happened with the again, I'm not an expert. What happened with the yeah, I'm not an expert in that. I think my understanding of it is that it was Ukrainian terrorists acting independently of U.S. approval. So what I read was that the U.S. was very frustrated. This stuff's somewhat in the domain of speculation.
So was it just it's like it was a matter of what he said rather than how he wasn't really even a political target exactly, or a military target?
Well, we have to discuss questions of degree here. So, what's absurd is to talk about Dugin and to suggest that, Putin's crazed expansionist strategy, like I very often read this, follows directly from Dugin's playbook, right? And it's like, part of the function of this kind of claim is to obscure the fact that, in a lot of respects, and I'm not, it's not about sitting here and saying Putin is good or bad, but a lot of the decisions he's made are intensely pragmatic, right? And are arising from very real sort of geopolitical factors, right? So when you say that, he's following the playbook of this sort of bizarre para-fascist esoterist or whatever, it provides this veneer of craziness to the whole thing. That having been said, Dugin is a major nationalist figure. I think he would reject that label because he's not pro-nation state as a form. We'll talk about that later. But he's considered a major nationalist figure. And, he has been very, very vocal in his view about these engagements in Ukraine, very, very strongly supportive of Russia. So I think you can imagine that, he could be targeted just on those grounds, right? Not because, he's dictating orders to Putin or anything. That's silly.
So now, correct me if I'm wrong, and I'll even edit this out if I am wrong, but my understanding of Aleksandr Dugin is that he claims to have developed a fourth way to politics, or
Fourth political theory.
Yeah, fourth political theory. So, he's developed this fourth political theory that is not fascism, it's not Marxism,
it's not liberalism. It's not liberalism.
It's liberal democracy.
It's not liberal democracy.
Those are
none of the above. Yeah.
He breaks the world up into three major strains of political thought, and those would be the ones, right? Fascism, liberal democracy, or Marxism.
Yeah, so we have to kind of, so I want to, in my essay, what I really want to, and obviously it's connected with current events, but what I really want to do is I want to, again, because I think an interesting question is, why is it that Dugin has begun to occupy this really inordinate place within the Western imaginary? Why has his importance become so exaggerated? And I touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think there are two maybe fundamental reasons for this. And I think one is because, in many ways, Dugin is the kind of thinker where, there's a lot of odious aspects to his thought, but even more than his thought is odious, if we carefully analyze it, he makes a lot of declaratory statements about, the West is, the land where the sun sets and all is destroyed. And, with regard to his thought in the 90s, my work is more fascist than fascism, and so on. So I think by establishing a link between him and the Putin regime, it kind of services this idea, that Putin equals Hitler. And then I think you can take it one step further, because I think that, in the context of this kind of ridiculous Russiagate, and this sort of liberal equation which exists, right? Like Hitler equals Putin equals Trump, and this kind of thing. Even more so than he may be influential in Russia, Dugin has a lot of connections with what we term the alt-right in the West, right? So he met Steve Bannon in Rome, I believe. I think it's Paul Gottfried, right, who coined the term alt-right, I believe. Probably. And I think Gottfried wrote the foreword to his book on Heidegger. So, on one hand, like in the liberal imaginary, right, this checks a lot of boxes, right? Because on one hand, we have, Putin, okay, like all the enemies of the US are like, crazed madmen, right? This is always what we say, right? But on one hand, we have, Putin, who Dugin is sort of parafascistic, and Putin is following Dugin's playbook. Then Putin is parafascistic by extension, if not outright fascistic. And then we also have this tie-in with the alt-right and with Trump, right? And I think that explains a lot of the proliferation of these things. But I want to, and what you see is that, in the service of that kind of equation, which I call, Hitler equals Putin equals Trump, right? In the service of that kind of equation, I think there's been a certain lack of objectivity in how his work has been approached. So, by the way, I'm very much a Marxist. I have plenty of qualms and disagreements with Dugin, obviously.
Sure.
That should just go without saying to anyone watching.
Yeah, obviously.
This. Yeah. But I think that, I think that we should try to address it in an honest way. So if you look at people like, Ronald Biner or Marlene Laruelle, actually even Matt McManus wrote an article called Just Call It Fascism, which I respond to at the beginning of my essay. But I want to stress that McManus isn't novel in this respect. And if anything, McManus, as you probably know, is a better reader than many, even if he, I think, has some of the same ideological issues. One of the tendencies is to try to take what is, I think, a pretty complex system that Dugin sets up, and to just say this is fascism, to do a sort of reduction.
Well, how does Dugin distinguish his fourth political theory from fascism?
Well, we'll get to the fourth political theory. We should start, before we get to the fourth political theory, we should start with the 90s, maybe. Right? Because that's where his thought starts, foundations of geopolitics. And actually, it's a really big defect of most of the Western and American readers of Dugin that they focus very heavily on the fourth political theory and on his work that's influenced by Heidegger, partly, again, to reinforce this equation, Dugin's a Nazi, like, via Heidegger. But really, one of the major defects is that most of them aren't very well equipped to actually understand Russian history. So they tend to ignore his work in the 90s a little bit more. And that becomes an issue because it ends up obscuring the extent to which I think Soviet and Russian culture shapes his own sort of idiosyncratic worldview. So, with Dugin, my understanding, so Dugin was part of the Yashensky Circle. I think you pronounce it Yashensky Circle in Moscow when he was young. And he was part of neo-Nazi organizations like Pamyat. So very much a fascist when he was young. And he was ostracized within Soviet society. I think the story goes that he was a street sweeper, right? He couldn't access higher level of education because his views were so bizarre. And, these people all, they were sort of Hitler sympathizing, and they loved like Avola and all of this.
So this is after the Soviet Union.
Before. So
in 1990, we're talking about, or in the
80s.
Okay,
80s.
Okay.
In the 80s, Dugin was, I would describe him as being, just sort of a garden variety fascist.
Now, how did the Soviet Union deal with fascists in their society at that time? Wait, what did he see the inside of a jail cell? What kinds of things happened to Dugin at that time, or what was permitted?
Yeah.
In the United States, I would think, you can be a little fascist, you can go to your little meetings, you can print up pamphlets, but you're going to be completely ostracized and fringe. But I would think that in the Soviet Union, there would be far less tolerance for that kind of thing at that time, particularly maybe, but overall, than there was in the West. Am I wrong?
No, you're completely right. And actually, this is what I was saying. So Dugin was a kind of, he's a fascist, right, and an occultist in the 80s. You could argue forever, but in a less ambiguous sense, certainly more conventional. Because of this, he wasn't able, though I don't think he came from a family of some education, actually. And even today, I believe he speaks something like 5 languages. So he's fairly literate and well-read. But he wasn't able to pursue higher education. I think it obstructed his ascent. So I think he only did a little bit of higher education. I think eventually he became like a street sweeper. And in this time, remember that even these people like, Heidegger and so on, I'm trying to remember the name of, he wrote Babikin. That's right. There was a Heidegger scholar, not necessarily a Heidegger scholar, but Babikin, it was this Russian scholar. And a lot of these philosophers like Heidegger, they weren't really considered appropriate for general consumption. So, what happened in the 80s is that Babikin was making basically archival notes on Heidegger's work that were then being bootlegged, right, sort of samizdat literature, and then being distributed to some of these occultist groups and things like that, which maybe can help explain his later predilection for Heideggerianism, though that develops a little bit later. But so he starts out as this kind of, not so different than, run-of-the-mill sort of fascism. But then what happens, things start to change when the Soviet Union falls, or as the Soviet Union is in the process of collapsing. So, we know the story, right, about Gorbachev, right, and the August coup and all these kind of things, the aborted August coup, and the sort of chaos throughout the Eastern Bloc and all this. But I think one thing we don't tend to talk about a lot is some of the ideological changes that were taking place in that time. So, there was a thinker in that time called Aleksandr, I hesitate to call him a philosopher, but he was called Aleksandr Prokhanov. And Prokhanov began to develop a new interpretation of Marxism, we might say. It might be charitable to call it that. But Prokhanov's basic tendency was to read Marxism through the prism, kind of jettisoning a lot of the, the scientific epistemology and a lot of the core historical materialism and reading it through the prism of Russian culture, right? So suddenly, like distinctly Russian identity became, the Soviet Union became a manifestation of that potentially. And you see this because, like, people who had been geopolitical allies or were anti-Western, perceived as anti-liberal democracy. In any case, he would characterize them as like orthodox. So he would be like, oh, Yasser Arafat, orthodox, like Fidel Castro, orthodox, Jean-Marie Le Pen, orthodox. Right? So it's quite bizarre. And people kind of mocked this at the time. They were like, this guy probably never read the Communist Manifesto. That was because it's like a very illiterate and weird culturalization of Marxist history or Soviet history in any case.
Did he write, this guy?
Prokhanov, yeah, he wrote some different texts. Yeah. And like obviously this is, I think what you'd have to understand is that in this period when the Soviet Union was in the throes of collapse, like because Gorbachev was leaning towards a kind of westernized social democracy, let's say, and that vision became even more, unreserved in terms of buying into the global market under Yeltsin. What you had in Russia, if you look at people who are skeptical about the changes with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the two groups you had were kind of far left. You had like your hardcore kind of Stalinist, okay, we shouldn't bring this down, right? Mm-hmm. And you had your far right, right? And you might think, well, the far right, they would be happy, right, that the Soviet Union was falling. But the way that it was happening, right, they saw it as a capitulation to Western culture. Right. And so you can understand someone like Prokhanov, right, in this time, he was trying to also create a politically convenient synthesis between, what we might term far right and far left. So with Dugin, Dugin had been a pretty conventional fascist, but then he starts to expose himself to Prokhanov, and his views begin to change. So in several pieces, he writes something in the early 90s called The Great War of the Continents. And in it, he outlines a lot of what we're going to see later in, I think, his longest book, Foundations of Geopolitics. And there he's really influenced by, he starts the essay, it's really funny. He says, well, a lot of people have talked about, the Judeo-Masonic form of conspiracy. But he said, I'm going to put that aside for today. Kids, we're going to talk about something else, right? Another conspiracy that we haven't adequately paid attention to. And this for him is sort of the geopolitical conspiracy. So, Halford Mackinder, and I'm not an expert in Mackinder, but Mackinder divides history between continental and Atlanticist powers, right? So, a quintessentially Atlanticist power would be like Carthage, which is sort of like, porous and loosely regulated, and based on kind of the self-transformation of its own horizons through sea travel. Whereas a quintessentially continental power would be Rome, right, with like strong military order, continentally based, authoritarian government, and so on, right? And, getting away, what happens at this point, and it's actually interesting because Dugin was in a neo-Nazi group, Pamiat, but he was actually kicked out, I think, in 1988 because they said, you're not anti-Semitic enough, you got to get So his views were starting to change, right, in a way. And what he does in this essay, The Great War of the Continents, is he argues that, the real antagonism that guides history isn't, Jew and non-Jew or, proletariat and bourgeois or social classes or whatever, but that it's really sea powers and land powers, right? Atlanticist and sort of fasciocratic, sea powers and land powers, right? This is what he does. And that, what's going on in Russia in the 90s, right? You have this really, really spectacular collapse, right? So, a lot of people imagine that, when the Soviet Union came down, they would be sort of enjoying European style living standards, right? Instead you had, rampant alcoholism, high infant mortality, pervasive privatizations that were harming the public, a lot of women going to the sex work and blah, blah. And also in this time, of course, you had companies and that shares in the companies that were diffused, right? So the public would become shareholders in these companies rather than them being centralized as public assets. But then people were so desperate and they didn't really understand commercial practice that, sort of savvy quasi-entrepreneurs who'd flourished in the latter part of the Soviet period, they were buying up these shares and they would later become the oligarchs. Right.
I want to ask you a question. You just mentioned something. I want you to go over it again. So you mentioned that did he read or did he write a book about geopolitics?
Well, so his break with more traditional forms of fascism comes in the early 90s with a serialized essay called The Great War of the Continents. And that's where you have the introduction of the thesis of Mackinder being very important as a replacement for kind of the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy model, which eventually, at that point, he's a bit equivocal. Eventually, he comes to at least, to thoroughly deny that. But a few years later, I'm going to say a few years later.
I want you to help me with my general education here for a moment. And the term geopolitics gets thrown around a lot. But does it have its own theoretical basis? The idea of geopolitics is to try to explain the conflicts in the world, and what the basis of those conflicts are.
So there's a long history. There's a long history in human thought of like geographical determinism.
Right.
So you can even look at Montesquieu, and he does this. I'm not an expert in the contemporary tradition of geopolitics, but my understanding is that Halford Mackinder is usually considered to be, the author of it. And one thing that Mackinder really stresses from an American standpoint is the need to avoid a union between Russia and Germany. Because if Russia and Germany were ever to work together, right, it would pose a kind of existential threat to the Anglo-American power. I may be vulgarizing a little bit in my presentation, but this becomes very important for Dugin.
Right. So I want to underscore that fact. Look, and it may be, I was in New York recently, and a Marxist friend of mine was saying, I can't believe there are so many people claiming to be experts in geopolitics these days. And he was just like, and he just thought that it was like a massively reactionary, like a symptom of right-wing reaction having taken its whole, gripping public imagination, right? And I just didn't, I was just like, well, yeah, geopolitics. It's like the politics between different regions in the world. I didn't even grasp it. The point is that this is an alternative way of theorizing and explaining why nations or regions or ethnicities go to war.
Yeah, and sometimes I think it tends to be, I think it tends to be somewhat historically insensitive and essentializing, which is why you could, and I think it's had a lot of, again, I'm not an expert in this,
right? It's because these are seafaring folk. They're always going to go to war with the land.
Yeah. So but I also know that in the Soviet Union they actually banned geopolitics because they claimed it was like reactionary. So that's another interesting thing.
Yeah. Okay. So right.
And that's part of.
I think that's worth pausing to note.
Yeah.
Because so many people are going on TV these days, as my friend pointed out, and I was oblivious to what he meant with the little underneath their names so and so geopolitical analyst or geopolitics expert. It's like, okay. So
I think there's kind of an esoteric and an exoteric way of using it. I would be really interested to explore how it sort of came into mainstream usage like that, because I think now the term is often used very loosely. It needn't imply geographic determinism, for example.
Right. It may not, people using the term may not directly mean it, but there is this sort of, I don't know, I've noticed there's this sort of realist presumption or presupposition that gets thrown around even by people who don't outright claim to be realists. And when they talk about, you have to understand that, these two nations are at war, just when you think about geopolitics as the politics of conflict and war. Yeah. Right. You're essentializing conditions that we really don't want to essentialize. Anyway, go on.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, so his break with the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy, I feel so silly saying these words, and really, honestly,
it's another theory like geopolitics.
His break with the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy, it occurred with the Great War of the Continents, but the result of that drift was the publication of the Foundation of Geopolitics, which came out in 1997. And that was actually compiled based on, now I remember I was talking about the instability experienced in Russia in the 90s. One of the big questions in this time was, what are we going to be, right? and people weren't really sure. And I think that what was going on in this period was that Boris Yeltsin had evinced a great deal of support for the idea of Westernization. They'd thrown open the doors to private capital. They tried to cozy up to the West. He said, to the sort of components of the Soviet Union, take as much sovereignty as you could swallow. But eventually they began to realize that goodwill wasn't being reciprocated. In fact, they were really beginning to be exploited, right, for that, right? So, there are a number of signs of this, NATO expansion, into the region, which Russia had been very opposed to, was one that is occurring in the late 90s. Another one was what happened with the homeland war in Yugoslavia, and the strong support given by the U.S. to the anti-Serbian forces, including most damningly for Russia, Kosovo. And they were also facing internal domestic difficulties, right? Because most famously, you had the two Chechen wars, right? And it's the second Chechen war in which Putin kind of makes his name as a strongman, right? Using these sort of horrific campaigns of civilian attack targets and everything, in order to stamp out the insurrection, which, to be fair, was kind of a theocratic insurrection.
I remember this, but remind me when that happened. Was it 99?
Yeah, I think it was 99 was the second war. And there were some serious terrorist attacks in Russia as well. And there's some question about whether some of those may have been false flag attacks. But certainly it had caused a lot of fear, and I think
it was an outrage on CNN. People were really upset about it. They made Russia was off its leash. This was a terrible atrocity.
Well, it signaled a turning point because they had given up a lot, but what they began to realize was that a policy of unlimited sovereignty could only terminate in the breakup of Russia, which is what the West wanted. Because the West doesn't want a big country like that, right? Because it's always a problem, like China, always a problem, right? I think there was a need for a turn. And I think in this context, not that, of course, Dugin's agenda was the one they adopted, but this is the context in which Dugin begins to attract more attention. So there's a Russian military academy from 92 to 95. He's invited to give some lectures there. And actually, interestingly, in this time, the ideas of Prokhorov are becoming more and more popular. You have communist candidate, and there's a conspiratorial belief.
Can I ask you a question before you go? You said something that I want to unpack. Mm-hmm. You said the United States doesn't want a big country like Russia or China.
Yeah,
and I'm assuming you mean a very productive, powerful country, not really just a matter of the size of the landmass or even the size of the population, right?
Well,
a unified, productive country, or what? What I mean, or is it? Do you mean they don't want a country that has that landmass, that has that centralized form of government, and that has that size of population? Which do you mean?
I would see it as both, because the thing is, you have to ask yourself, why is it that China was able to be relatively successful? Right? If we compare it to other parts of what we could term the global South, they've a lot of people been raised out of poverty. There's relatively advanced infrastructure and so on. So why is it that and a lot of it has to do with the fact China was a semi-colonial nation that the West and Japan were trying to divide up, but they never were able to divide it up. And what this meant is that when the communists took power, they took power over this very large population. And, they're able to, in the context of breaking out of the global market, they had a huge population base to work with. And then even later, after Tiananmen, the US would go try to sanction them, but they were doing so much production and it was such a big population, they couldn't. I mean, if you compare it to a small island like Cuba, today, look at the horrors being inflicted, right, because of the US embargo.
So the combination, the population size and the productivity are not disconnected, right?
Yeah.
But there are two things about having a big population. One is you can have very large armies, and the other is you can employ a massive amount of people and be very productive.
Yeah.
Right. And the idea that you do that under one political order or one state means that you can create a power in the world. This a credible power, a power both in terms of economic prowess and productivity and militarily. And that's what the United States doesn't want. And the question I have, I guess, is why? Why wouldn't the United States want that? And why wouldn't something like the EU also be a threat to the United States? Because it's another way of organizing a massive amount of people under one currency anyway, and to some degree under one governing body. So what is it about that another nation becoming powerful that is a threat to the United States in particular?
Well, and I want to get back to Dugin in a second, but I'll just say that if you look at the EU, to a large extent, its interests, in terms of, parity of wealth and exploitation of, foreign rents and so forth, they are partly united with the United States, right? And by the very nature of how much poorer they are, countries like Russia and China are going to end up on the other side of the coin, and we see the way that they cultivate connections.
The difference is that, so their foreign rents, the fact that they collect foreign rents and the United States collects foreign rents, and by that you mean what exactly? That you're talking about?
Well, like over 50% of the manufacturing capital in Africa is owned by foreign powers, for example, right? Mostly European and American.
Okay, so is that rent?
You could call it rent. Yeah, sometimes economists will. Piketty uses that terminology, for example.
Okay. Yeah. And on what basis is that considered rent?
Well, it's the idea that, you're able to, because like those resources reside there, but, because of the investments that have been made by the West, they're able to shave off like a huge amount of what they're generating, right? And the idea is that, if you have that sort of preferential position with respect to, much of the global South, or what we might term the developing world, that you can see how there's a basis for common interest. But that we shouldn't overextend that.
Understanding of the term rent is that it is a portion of the surplus value produced that doesn't actually that isn't itself productive. Like you pay rent to a landowner for the right to use the land.
Yeah, it's a different use of the term.
Or you might be paying rent in the form of paying for the right to buy somebody's intellectual property, or rent their intellectual property. But it's a matter of property relations. And so I guess owning the factories means that in a way, but if you own the factory but someone else owns the company, then they would be paying you rent. But if you own the factory and you're producing goods and you're producing real commodities, and that's part of the productive economy, not the financial economy, I would think. So the question is, so you're exploiting the working class, but not the whole nation necessarily.
Well, so if you look at countries that are able to rise out of what we might term third world conditions, and whether it's and they really vary, but whether it's China or Japan or Russia or whatever you want to talk about. They've done so because they've established domestic control. In other words, like they're not, dependent on Western firms coming in, and taking these giant cuts, right?
Well, and in the case of Japan, there was a huge relationship between foreign U.S. investment and. After,
but the thing is, like, the U.S. actually, in their attempts to build up Japan as a counterweight to China, they knew that part of the idea here was to have a strong Japan, right, that served as an alternative ideological template in Asia, and that also would be loyal to the US.
Well, no, Japan was important to build up productively, and in order to have bases and also raw materials to engage in the Cold War.
Yeah, so they did two things. They gave them massive technology transfer. They handed over US technology free, which for a lot of places they will not do. And the second thing is they let Japan, like even, companies like, I think Toyota's 49% public control. They let them have a sort of Keynesian policy of, national ownership and so on. But, if you look at ascending right out of the depths of poverty, it's really, really important to have national ownership. And we can talk about, socialism is another thing.
Right. So that's in the background of your, there is that, and somehow or another, because of, we'll have to pick apart why. I think there are reasons why The EU isn't considered a threat right now. Of course, not so long ago, Europe was at war with itself. So, and none of these things really hold. But in any case, the theory that Dugin has around geopolitics, you're telling the story to go back to that. You're telling the story of how Dugin developed, and it had to do. You're saying that it had to do. His rise had to do with confronting U.S. imperialism in Russia.
Yes, very much so. So if we look at this book, so he did these lectures at a Russian military academy. And remember at this time that the big question in Russia is, where do we go now, right? And you're seeing the sort of failures of Yeltsin era policy in this time. And in Foundations of Geopolitics, what Dugin argues is this is where you have this idea of red-brown, right? And Dugin begins from the fascist premises to some extent of his younger self.
The fascist premises being the anti-Semitism.
No, he doesn't start with anti-Semitism, but this is to say that the book is sort of
of the folk and the nation or the local.
Well, not necessarily, not the nation as we'll see, but let me elaborate this.
Okay.
He doesn't say.
What are the fascist premises?
Let me explain this. So the book is best understood as he wants to propose a synthesis of fascism and communism, right? And in order to support this synthesis, he wants to argue that both fascism and communism are endowed with structural flaws, which have prevented them from being as successful as they could be, right? So when he looks at fascism, the seed of which, and there's a number of examples, like he has this great affection for Japan, for example, but perhaps the most notable manifestation of it is Germany, right? When he looks at fascism, what he sees is that, fascism is in a paradoxical position because it appeals to sort of the pre-modern society, right? This sort of autocatonic essence, right? Which is outside, kind of the degeneration of liberal modernity, right? But for Dugin, the problem is that then fascists become obsessed with race and nation, right? And for him, he's like, race and nation are modern categories, right? The nation state, right? Race as a defined biological notion. So he sees fascism as having betrayed itself, right? As having gone awry because of its belief in these things. And I know this is amazingly eccentric as an argument, particularly by Western standards.
I don't know. I mean, I think he might be onto something there. And nation are both modern categories. So if you're going to break with modernity, you would want to break with those categories.
Yeah, well, it works. He's not a, again, like Dugin, again, I find a lot of his thought odious, but.
So does he turn to religion or cultural tradition rather than these categories of race and nation?
So he has a strong relation to orthodoxy, which because of my own part, I'm going to focus more on some of the Soviet stuff because it's more important, but also because I don't have as good a knowledge of orthodoxy as I would like. But what he argues is that in order to supersede, this failed rendition of fascism that we saw in the 20th century, what we need is to look to communism, right? Now, for him, if we look at the history of communism in Russia, he sees communism. Now, fascism's flaw was that it went too far in the direction of race and the nation. The fault of communism is that it became too immersed in a kind of universalist angle, according to which we need, global revolution and so on and so forth. And in doing so, it lost sight of the importance of localized culture, right? Or maybe imperial or regional culture, right? So when he talks about the history of communism in the Soviet Union, he delineates between good kind of national communists, right, who participated in the Russian spirit, and were realizing communism in a way that was authentically premised by Russian history, right? So Lenin is one, but his big guy above all is Stalin, right, as being the definitive Russian cultural kind of communist. And then he talks about sort of the degenerated universalist school of communism, right? That rejects these more localized features and, simply seeks a kind of global revolution and so on. And for him, archetypal figures who embody this would be, for example, Leon Trotsky, right, with the theory of permanent revolution, or Mikhail Gorbachev, whose actions ultimately led to the dissolution of the USSR, right? So what he wants to say is he wants to say that, fascism has something to offer communism, which is a, more acute and profound appreciation for culture and history, right? The ethnos, and all of this. But communism also has something to offer fascism, which is the refusal of these modern categories of race and nation, because the Soviet Union was a really unique, right? Because, while they did engage in the persecution of certain groups, I mean, it had long held an officially anti-racist position. They'd done a huge amount to assuage tensions. And also it was a kind of supranation that wasn't really precedented before that, right? And that provides the template in a strange way, even for the European Union. So this is the basic setup. And he reads this through the categories of of the interactions between Russia and Germany. So for him, to defeat the Atlanticist powers, what would have been necessary and what remains necessary, right, is for there to exist a coalition between Germany, which is the most powerful continental nation in Western Europe, and Russia, right? And he also loops in a few other countries that he thinks would be germane to that, like Iran, he's a big fan of, and he really likes the Iranian, Shia theocracy, and Japan and Vietnam and so on. But he sees really the possibility of a greater cooperation between Russia and Germany as having been thwarted because of the ideological degenerations that were embraced by both fascism and communism. So, he claims it was a perversion of Nazism related or arising from their position on race and nation that led them to abandon the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which they had with the USSR, and to turn their sights on dominating the Soviet Union, right? And, I think all this stuff, obviously a lot of this is pretty harebrained, right? Though maybe it works at the level of argumentation, but it's pretty out there, right? But
what do you think is the most out there about what he's saying?
Well, I mean, I think that, we've talked about, the problems of geopolitics and geographical determinism.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Example, right. Which I think this is the problem. If you really were to look to the foundations of the system, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. And a lot of it is barely above horoscope level at that point. And a lot of the interpretations of history are quite dicey as well. Do you really believe that, it was racism and nationalism and the embrace of that drove the Nazis against the Soviet Union? I mean, it's not that there's nothing to that, but it's a very conjectural theory that Dugin doesn't adequately defend. And a lot of his work is quite declaratory in this way. So there's a lot of issues. But I think it's actually
interesting to you. What do you find most interesting about it?
What I find most interesting about it, I'll tell you what I find most interesting about it. What I find most interesting, I think it's very, 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 and again, I don't deny that Dugin is a fascist thinker. But I do think his fascism is I call it the Apple state fascism. I think it's quite weird, right? And I think that if we're really going to try to deal with it, we have to discuss honestly the influence of communism, so the Soviet experience, on his work. And again, with a lot of Western thinkers, they don't pay adequate attention, I think, to these influences. The tendency is just to say, Dugin, he's just concealing his racism, even though, by the way...
And when you say the Soviet experience, do you really mean the way in which the United States dominated the former Soviet Union after the collapse of the Soviet Union?
No. I'm going to explain that. I'm going to explain that in a second, what I mean.
Okay.
But, I think when you see people who critique Dugin, very often they're just Dugin, one thing you see very common, they're Dugin, he's just a racist, right? And I find this very weird. Now, McManus is a bit above this, because McManus will say, Dugin is just fascism, like of an undistinguished variety, but you don't need to necessarily be a biological racist to be a fascist, which is maybe a little bit more sophisticated. But a lot of people will literally say, like Ronald Biner, who was beefing with me on Twitter a bit, a lot of people will say, well, he's just a racist. Now, I'm not denying that he's willing to form strategic coalitions with racists, or that maybe he de facto ends up supporting a lot of those things. But when we look at his body of work, for a long time, he has said that he sees racism as the principal, failure, right? And even in later works, we'll talk about the fourth political theory, it kind of inflates to this, targets blossom in the air, it inflates to this neurosis where, racism is everywhere, right? It's the great sin of our world, maybe absent a real analysis of economic structures, right? So I think that we do have to take that seriously. But I think part of what, where that's coming from is that we don't in the West tend to really have a very strong appreciation of Russian history, right? And this is not just going to be a problem with reading Dugin. It's going to be a problem with understanding the current war as well, which Dugin has been involved in propagandizing. Mm-hmm. So, we tend to throw around these words, right? In the West, we say like imperialism, right? Colonialism, right? And sometimes, very arbitrary and I think ridiculous comparisons get made. I mean, I know in the New York Times, they were comparing the removal of Russian monuments in Ukraine to the removal of Confederate monuments in the South, which, I find pretty distasteful as a comparison, all things considered, and fairly ignorant, but hey, it's the New York Times, right? But the thing is that, so if you look at Russision history, and Samir Amin points this out in his book, actually.
Yeah, on what basis did they make that comparison?
It's just absurd. It's just absurd. Like, it's bad.
I could see comparing it to the toppling of statues of Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
Right. Or something like that.
Yeah.
Comparing it to the removal of Civil War heroes or so-called heroes and, it's stupid. But okay, keep going.
Well, let me talk about it, because I think this is really, really important, right? This is really, really important. So, like, if we look at race, right? Like, race is basically a category which is devised in its biological form, right, in early modernity, when we have colonization, right? So some people attribute it to Gomes de Zazura, the I believe Portuguese writer, who was commissioned to provide a justification for Portuguese African slavery. And he was like, oh, they're black, they're inferior, but we should help them also somehow by enslaving them, and this kind of thing. But it's fairly historically specific in that way. And what one would have to understand about Russia is that Russia only, it didn't really have a fully capitalist development. There's a kind of intermediary period there, like in the late 19th century, in the early 20th century, before 1917, right? And then I know, Prestonians like you would say capitalist after, but okay, we don't have to go into that. But there's this sort of intermediary period. But what really happens with Russia, it passes pretty quickly from being a kind of tributary empire to, it was very antique in a lot of ways, to being a kind of sui generis socialist or quasi-socialist sort of state.
Right. I mean, at the beginning of the Russian Revolution, one of the tasks, however you want to think about what capitalism is, one of the tasks of the Soviet government that Lenin took up was industrializing Russia or the Soviet Union. So, and dealing with the peasant farmers was a big aspect of what their policies had to be about in, the early part and all the way up, I think, into the 50s in the Soviet Union. So, obviously we're not talking about the same level of technological and economic development in the Soviet Union as has already taken place in Britain or the United States, which is where capital and industrialization happened first. So it's a very different history. Sure. So would it be fair to say that Dugin has a more of a living memory of pre-modernity than a Western member of his same generation would.
Well, it's not
Not a truly living, but but it's a little closer. It's within 100 years rather than 300.
Well, so here's the rational kernel, right?
Okay.
The rational kernel and the mystical shell. And this is what I really want to pick out of Dugin's work, rather than just saying, dismissing it. Where is it coming from, right? And, if you look at, Samir Amin in the book, Russia and the Long Transition to Socialism, and I think now we can say very long, he talks about the history of this, and he says, look, if you look at Russia's relationship with its external territories, right, because it was not, a capitalist mode of production in the same way as what we saw in Europe, right, and because of its particular character, it had political domination in a lot of those areas, right? So you saw like Russification, but it didn't really economically exploit them heavily, right? They hadn't been transformed into resource providers to feed, grist for the mill capital.
That would mean, but through the use of military might, primarily, there would be political domination in regions, but the day-to-day lives of people were left largely alone in terms of the way their productive activity went and the forms of everyday life. Would that be
channels
fair?
Channels of tribute were restructured, but you didn't have something like a core periphery divide, right? That was like this line that separates, the wealthy capitalist nations from exploited sources of resources in the less developed world. So, and then this even becomes more, because rather than like in the way that Ataturk would, like trying to follow a Western style model of development, when the Soviet Union starts, they try to create something novel.
Why is that core periphery so important? Am I right in thinking that it had to do with more autonomy for the local populations that had been conquered by Russia?
No. The core periphery, I'm talking about Western Europe had the core periphery. And what I'm saying is that...
in the core periphery relationship, what you're talking about is proletarianization of the periphery?
No, I'm not talking about proletarian. I'm talking about preventing proletarianization of the periphery. In other words, like basically using them as like resource suppliers, right? And keeping that relation.
But what do you mean? So they didn't. So when a U.S. company sends a factory to China, that is not proletarianizing, and
that's very different. That's very different because China already was industrialized with the communists, so then that allowed them to become a producer
to Vietnam or to Mexico or to any part of the world. Quite industrialized. It's any part of the world where what you're talking about is okay. So if you're taking people who were living off the land on one way or another, had more of a direct kind of more like peasants, and bringing them into factories. That's proletarianization, and that's not the problem with core periphery relationships.
Well, the thing is,
when you just grab resources and
the thing here is that, but here's the thing, right? That like, there were certain, I mean, we can't be too simplistic about this because there were certain forms of industrialization, we could say, like trains and so forth, that were built up, right? Because even if people were producing natural resources, right, or resources for production, those still had to be transported and so on and so forth. Right. So they couldn't be totally outside of that.
What happens is, like, when you go into undeveloped region, in order to employ people to provide raw materials, whether it's farm stuff or mining, or you maybe have people dig with their fucking hands, who knows? Nonetheless, whatever you have them produce does have to be transported. And if you have an industrial core, that you want it in a timely manner. You don't want to put them on horses so you're going to build the infrastructure to distribute. And once you start building the infrastructure, then you really are disrupting a lot of people's lives, and you're going to need to industrialize to build that infrastructure, which then starts to bring industrialization.
But the limits of the industrialization are usually circumscribed, right? Because
they're not necessarily circumscribed fully, like politically. Right. It's not the problem is in productive investment. And I mean, if capitalism worked the way it was supposed to, and everyone just kept growing and growing and growing, and profits always rained down from the sky, then there wouldn't be a core periphery, right?
Yeah.
Am I wrong on that?
No, well, so they were set up to become, these places were set up to be sort of vassals that could be exploited. And that's why you needed imperialism, which is the military threat behind it.
The way to put that is there's a division of labor around the world.
International division of labor. Yeah.
Right. But why should why should capital in the raw material, in the realm of raw material, in the nations where less manufacturing goes on and they're doing farming and things like that, be less productive and profitable than other parts of the
Well, I think very often it was massively profitable because, if you look at even the organic composition of capital and these kind of things, right, that's not the issue. I think it could be very profitable. I think what's very important.
So and value producing both, right? So that you majorly contributing to the surplus, so that everyone who's involved got a nice living wage, and then they also through the world market would have access to the manufactured goods from other parts of the world. So, if there was a living wage to proletarianized agricultural workers in the global South, and a world market where all these goods were distributed around the world, then there would be no reason for the wages of the global South to remain so low over time. But the problem is that what you have is constant crisis.
Well, what you have is you have militarily enforced exploitative relations. You have
the military comes in order to enforce the outcomes of those crises.
Yeah. You have super exploitation of labor. You have the breaking up of resistance of that.
What is super exploitation of labor?
Super exploitation of labor.
Because that you can do super exploitation of labor, or you get super profits by increasing.
Super profits are not super exploitation of labor.
Right, so what's the super exploitation of labor mean?
Well, I mean, if you're creating essentially a martial structure within a country like this, right? And there is no freedom, right? And they don't have things like, powerful labor unions and so on fighting in this way. What you're able to do is
when your wages. I mean, but the thing about the wages is that they're determined by the basket of commodities that is needed to survive.
Well, but I mean, if people if their living standards are held to an extremely low level, then Marx points out that it's variable, right? So if people are kept at absolute near death levels, right, then in comparison with what we might see, which is an upward growth, right?
I mean, that's always the inclination of every capitalist, is to keep the variable wage, the wages as low as possible to increase profitability. So that is exploitation, and
yes.
Super exploitation seems to. Whenever I hear that term thrown about, it's seeming to say, well, there are some workers, say in the first world, that aren't exploited, but rather because of the exploitation of the third world, they get to live beyond their actual contribution to the world economy. And the people who talk about that way generally think about economics in terms of use values. Rather than
sure. Well, I mean, part of it stems from the fact that when you're creating these goods, for import and consumption, right, into countries which are far wealthier, right, then you're setting wage rates which are much lower, right, in the periphery in that way. But I want to stress that there's a high level, there's a very strong martial structure, right, which is needed also to maintain that, which is what we saw in the context of imperialism. But we should try to circle back, because this will go on for a long time. We're getting into really core questions, which I'm also not prepared to discuss.
I think I'm just sort of instinctually asking these questions because I'm worried that the rational kernel of Dugin will be as anti-imperialism. Am I right? Is that the rational kernel of Dugin?
We'll get there.
Okay, just
probably
the rational kernel.
Probably a reasonable fear, but we'll get there. But
okay, all right. So how about this? We're an hour in. We're going to talk about the rational kernel of Dugin more in the second half, because I want to do a second hour. I'll tell you what, I'll send you another link in just a moment. I'm going to get a refill of my coffee and we'll do the second half. I hope I wasn't too disrupted there. I really am.
Do you mind if I get through? I just want to, before we shift to
one thing. Okay, so go ahead.
Let me get through this. So I think that, and this is going to be very important for understanding Dugin. So, his animus towards racism. I mentioned before that Russia was a kind of tributary country, and the category of race didn't have the same purchase within it, right? And then it became this kind of supranational structure in the context of the Soviet Union. And, if prior to the Soviet Union, Russia had politically dominated the territories external to it under its remit, but had not economically exploited them to the degree of what we find in the West, what happens in the Soviet Union is in many ways the dynamic becomes even more favorable to the areas around, right? So in the Caucasus, for example, they start sending money the other way, right, to actually build up those areas, right? So in that respect, it would be more analogous maybe to the Marshall Plan.
You're talking about state investment in production.
Yeah,
right.
State investment in genuinely raising the living standards in production.
When a company in the United States invests in a third world country,
just get the goods.
Different thing, right?
Yeah,
they just steal when they do that. But when the state in the Soviet Union invests in production in an underdeveloped region, that's like
when it's part of the same unit.
The West does it, it's stealing.
Well, when the goal is aimed, explicitly towards the leveling of living standards, right? And when rather than there being, wealth being taken from this, because actually, if you look at a lot of the Soviet policy, right? Like, and I mean, we could even talk about outside of the Soviet Union. So we could talk about
putting more money in than the more value in.
Oh, way more, way more. And this is why when Samir Amin talks about it, he says basically the Soviets invented authentic development assistance. And this wasn't just, we could talk about the Caucasus and places that actually benefited materially from that. But, even in Cuba, they were overpaying 5 times for sugarcane from the country, right? So they were literally just giving subsidies, right, to try to raise the level that way. So this is very, very different than what we see in the West.
And they were doing it on the back of fictitious capital or from profits earned elsewhere?
Profits earned elsewhere. They're being transferred, right? And this is also why places like a lot of places in Central Europe wanted really badly to bolt kind of the Russian camp because they were more productive and the wealth was really being kind of moved elsewhere. But all I want to say about this is that we're going to go deeper into Dugin in the second half. But I think that it's very, very important to understand the way that his fascist impulse, which obviously is a very important part of his work, is in some sense tempered by the particular political history of the Soviet Union, which is not a nation state in the simple sense, right? They were the first kind of pan-national association to give rights to states within, right? But also with respect to, the promotion of official anti-racism, right? And the extension of, genuine aid to these kind of regions. And I don't wish to obscure the fact that there were at times severe repressions, right? There were ethnic persecutions. I mean, of course, right? But if we really look at the more global picture of what was going on, and so I think this is going to give us the basic aporia of Dugin, right? Which is how do you be a fascist, right? But how do you build it upon these premises, which are so inimical to a lot of what we saw in fascism, emanating out of the West in the 20th century.
All right. We'll talk about that in the second half. I'm going to stop the recording here. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.